Welcome back to You Ask For It. It's a podcast where typically Pastor Steve and myself answer the questions that you give, or we walk through doctrinal statements and what it means for us as believers. Today, we're going to do something different. Pastor Steve is out of town on vacation, and so I have a special guest. Dr. Eric Williamson is here with us today. He teaches ethics and world religions, and he and I often have conversations of how the Bible matters for us today, or on church history, or what are the questions that your students are asking in your ethics courses. And so I thought it'd be fun if we had a conversation today about something that you're very interested in, the subject that we're going to talk about. You actually wrote a chapter in a book on this very subject, correct?
Correct, yes.
And so here's going to be the title of what we're going to look at today: God, Beauty, and the Building. Or think of it this way: the beauty in architecture. Would that be how you would say, you'd kind of preface it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So you taught some of this in Bob Lewis's Sunday school class about a year ago, this kind of very subject.
Yeah.
How did this come about for you that you want to teach this for people?
Well, with that case, they were kind of like the test subjects on how that would go. Talking about beauty and art and architecture in the church setting. But it kind of goes way back when my oldest son was very young. We were going through an old book, and there was just a chapel. Just, you probably just pictured it when I said chapel. And he pointed to it and said, "What is that?" And so it just made me think of, what do churches look like? Should they all look like the chapel with just the A-frame and just the steeple kind of thing? Not a lot of them look like that. So that was a little bit of that seed.
By show of hands, who here in the room they grew up in maybe a small chapel type church? Anybody here? Couple? Three? Yeah? Okay. So that feels normal for you to see a chapel like that.
Right, yeah. And for a lot of us, we would just recognize what that is. But I thought it was interesting that he did not, because we were attending a church at the time. Yeah. The church we were attending did not look like that. It had another kind of intention behind it. And that's where I started to think about it. And a lot of this too came with just the sanctuary renovation. I thought that was a good time to kind of discuss where all this is kind of coming from, because when you say beauty, how would you define it, kind of thing. I'm not asking you.
Yes. Well, how about this question? Because the question that we've maybe heard, or the statement that people have heard before is this: that isn't beauty just in the eye of the beholder, right? So is there a standard for it? How would you speak on that?
Yeah, and that seems to kind of get more behind, like, there is no such thing as beauty, right? Mm. If it's all just kind of what you think it is, then it doesn't really exist in that kind of way. And this gets a little bit into our disagreement, not between us.
Yeah, not our disagreement, but the whole subject of disagreement.
But our topics of disagreement, that if someone disagrees with you, then that must just kind of weaken any kind of belief you have. But I think with beauty, with art, and especially architecture, I think there is something there. Just because you disagree about it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Just like we'll just say randomly disagree about what's fair and what's just, right? It doesn't mean that doesn't exist. We have a little bit of disagreement. And Roger Scruton, he's a conservative philosopher who passed away a few years ago. He said art is kind of like sports. It's really not for everybody, but there's still meaning behind it. There is still purpose in that for a lot of individuals. And so we can still talk about art, architecture, just how we are as humans. And as Christians, we'll have that idea about what that is. Now, some others, though, Gene Edward Veith, an evangelical, had said that it's not whether or not we will live with art, it's if we will have bad or good art. It's going to happen. Gavin Stamp, not a Christian, but an architectural critic, he said the one art that you can't escape is architecture. You will always be around some kind of building, structure, or form, and there's always going to be some intention behind why they built it that way. And so this can get into, like you were saying, some of those big ideas of what is beauty, how would you define it? And it gets into the categories of what is good, usually how we kind of value that. And this can kind of, not that I'm going to get into ethics, but it's still the same kind of category of good actions. And we kind of understand that of what is beautiful. So you could ask the question, is God beautiful, right? How would we make a distinction between God being beautiful, who is spirit and truth, and his creation and his acts being beautiful? And I think a really good example for us is his redeeming nature, how he takes what is seemingly ugly and makes it into something beautiful. This happens through and through in John's gospel. John is the one of the four gospels who will portray the crucifixion as something beautiful, high and lifted up. And it is a very grotesque thing, right, that's happening. But we see the truth behind it, the true goodness and redemption in that. So that would be a way of understanding beauty from God's aspect of redeeming that. And so it's what is ugly would be the question, is the devil ugly kind of thing? And that could be where it's veering off of what is good or true. And so as someone has put it, when it gets to beauty and appreciating something for what it is, it's the difference between love and lust or adoration and appetite. Right? Are you truly appreciating what it is for its true value, or are you trying to use it for something? And that could be the kind of the distinction between God and what the enemy does.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah. Okay, how about this? How does this apply in the Bible? Do we find this at all in the Bible? I mean, that's pretty important. We're in a church.
Right.
We want to talk about it this way. Where will we find something like this in the Bible?
So as far as like an art theory, we can just see the practice of it. Bezalel, his calling in Exodus 35. I don't know if we have that.
I think we have that potentially on the screen. There we go.
So this is where God is calling Bezalel, but also to teach others. So Bezalel, the son of Uri in the tribe of Judah, he has been filled with God's Spirit, with wisdom, understanding. And that wisdom is interesting because it's the same word that's used in Proverbs chapter 3 and chapter 8, if you're familiar with those passages, where God is ordering creation. And so you kind of see this type of wisdom being poured out into this individual, but also to teach others. So, and it goes on into every kind of craft, every kind of weaving, all of these kinds of aspects of just Bezalel's calling. And so he will be the one that will carve out the Ark of the Covenant, lay it on with lots of gold, right? Yeah. A lot of ornateness to us. Yeah. So you can look to that. Hiram's calling in 1 Kings chapter 7. I don't know if that's up there, but it's kind of the similar kind of aspect that he has been gifted with this craft, with this talent, with wisdom in order to do this. And I think it's important for us to kind of look at what they're doing in the tabernacle and then later in the temple.
So what about this though? Because many of you maybe have been a part of churches that they have just, it's so ornate on the inside. And if you've been a part of a Baptist church kind of like ours, it can be overwhelming walking to there. And oftentimes the argument that maybe someone that's been a part of a Baptist church would say to there is that breaking God's second covenant? Right? You know, the second commandment of, don't create an idol of this and all that. What would you say on something like that? Because so I would say I've been to Israel multiple times. We have some people in here who are going to Israel. And when you walk into some of those churches, these old significant churches, there is gold everywhere and icons and all of these things. And it can rattle you if you've never experienced that before. When you walk in, you're like, what in the world is this? You know? How would you speak to that? How does this come into play? Because when we look at the scriptures here, the way in which they're even defining the first temple, it is gold everywhere.
Yeah.
So how does that apply even to the second commandment?
Yeah, so some art critics have said that about like Jewish artists, of just like they are wading into the area of taboo here, because Jewish heritage, look at the second commandment, no art forms whatsoever. And we would say that's bad hermeneutics, right? Like that's not what it says. But we could go by this of just the instructions for the tabernacle, for the temple, and all of the kind of ornateness. And I look at these, the columns here, the pilasters, and how they are very decorative. That would take place in the temple as well. There are instructions on how that would be carved out, pomegranates and leaves and all of that. But also the interesting thing that I find with the second commandment and the instructions is the cherubs. These massive, massive cherubs. And these
Can you
are the
explain what a cherub is for the people who don't know what a cherub is in this room? So it's probably just like one or two, but if you could just explain that, would be good. Yeah.
The cherubim, if you're familiar with the exile out of the garden, the angel that had the flaming sword, they're described as a cherub. Now there are some other types of angels too, the seraphim, that seems to be the fiery ones. But the representation in the tabernacle temple, that is the cherubs. And the reason I'm pointing back to the garden is this all seemed, the temple, the tabernacle, both seem to be a representation of the garden that's in Eden, right? Being there to dwell with God, with man, and to see God's nature and beauty and his creation. And so that's where I would take a little bit of an art theory from this to say that as Christians and appreciating art, it is that representation of God's beauty, of his creation. Now, you knew that I would wade into heresy here when talking about beauty and art, so that's a little poisoning the well. But Michelangelo, for instance, he had an idea that good painting, notice he says good, right? Good painting is just copying God's creation. Right? So copying God's creation and his perfections, and then recollecting God's painting, is how Michelangelo put it. Another Christian artist today, Makoto Fujimura, or Mako, we have an image of one of his paintings, the Lilies painting. Mako, so this is kind of abstract expressionism a little bit. You can kind of tell what it is. This is lilies of the field, right? And this is taken from Matthew. This is his understanding of just the colors and the beauty. So recall what I said from Roger Scruton, art might not be for everybody, right? But it could have...
I'll be honest, I would have not known that was lilies in the field if I would have looked at it the first time.
Right,
so,
And that's why I put consider the lilies.
Yeah, there you go, I appreciate that.
Yes, and this will be a good point later when we look at another Christian artist who says that you're going to have to explain what your art means. There's going to be meaning to it. And so if you're just leaving it in the hands of others, there's going to be a message or word to it. But Mako has said this, that God is the perfect artist. He doesn't need to create like imperfect humans need to create, but he does. But Mako says this, artists are fallen and prone to create God in our image, and even prone to create new gods. Right, and so that's kind of the warning sign of being a creator. As Adam and Eve were called to tend to the garden, we are those co-creators also, but in our fallen, sinful nature, have that inclination, prone to create, I guess. Yes. I'll update, come thou fount, prone to create new gods in that way. So I think that's an interesting kind of warning from a Christian artist.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. When I think about the subject, one day he and I were talking about this whole idea of this first temple and how just incredible it was, and all the detail and all of the gold. I mean, if you go back and just read about the first temple, it is an incredible thing to see. And he said something, I thought it was good. He said, you know where they got everything to build that temple with is when they plundered the Egyptians. Think about that. Everything that they used to build that first temple came when they took everything from the Egyptians and crossed the Red Sea to build it. which brought about this really interesting conversation I think it's worth talking about, is this whole idea of God being a redeemer. What we've seen throughout history, well, there's this conversation of, should we ever use anything that's used in the world, right? Do we use anything that's secular? Is that okay to do? But what we see is even from the first temple, what God's people have done time and time again is they've taken the things of the world and redeemed them to be used by God, right? Okay. And so what about this whole idea of plundering the Egyptians? And then with this, our conversation, what are the things that we even see in this room where we have in some ways plundered the Egyptians?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the outside, the exterior, when you're walking in, and if you've been over in Europe, it's very much like walking into like a Greco-Roman temple, right? Just the front of it. I already warned you I was wading into heresy here. But then as you come in, a lot of this has just been borrowed from that. But before I point out some of these things, I wanted to mention a kind of Christian theologian, philosopher, Richard Niebuhr. He had a book called Christ and Culture, and he talked about just kind of these different positions of is the church just completely against anything in the culture? Just there's nothing good in it. He talks about one, though, in that kind of redeeming way, that Christ is the transformer of culture. Right, and we'll redeem it, and I think that's helpful in these ways. So just looking at the pilasters or these columns, they're fluted. You'll find that on all of these old Greco-Roman temples. The acanthus leaves at the top of the capitals. That's where they were trying to kind of replicate beauty. The dentellation, the eggendar, all of that following. But what really struck me is the circles up here. So you see some lines in between these kind of circular disc shapes. Those are called triglyphs in the middle, but there's more than three. But the circles in the middle, you may have seen some of these like in your home, like in the door frame. They're called rosettes. They kind of have a circular pattern and kind of have more of like a convex nature in the middle kind of thing. That's a very old symbol that's used on a lot of Roman ways of putting into their arches and all of that. So we'll get to that one in just a moment, but I wanted to bring up one that's the edicule. So it's, I think, the wall image up there. So this is kind of small to see. This is a small shrine. It's called edicule, it just means little house, and it's a little shrine that these Romans would have in their homes dedicated to their different deities or divinities, and would practice that. And if you go into like the Pantheon in Rome, these are all over the place, but they've put these saints in them now. What's interesting, edicule is where we get our word edifice, right? Just this exterior kind of thing. And this has been actually transformed into the hearth, right? This, if you notice, it looks exactly like a mantle, right? Where you would have the fire burning in the middle where the shrine would be. And so it became this idea that the hearth is the heart of the room. So in a way, a room without a hearth is heartless kind of thing. Gotcha. So that would be one way. That looks a lot like the front of our church also, right?
It does. That's what I was thinking.
Or even the doorway to the chapel, or even to the education. I'm always, if you ever see me walking around, my head's in the clouds, it's because I'm looking at all of the other things. The buildings, yeah. But there were some questionable birds on the steeple also, so maybe that was a little troubling. So you kind of have that. Another one that I was talking about, these kind of circular discs. So I think it's Hadrian. This is on Hadrian's arch. And it's very difficult to see, but you do see the edicules. But you do see the round markings on both of those, and then on the upper pediment in the center. If you go to the next patera, I believe is the image, what these really were in that time were these basically sacrificial basins. When they would sacrifice their animal in Rome, that would be there to collect the blood, and the thumb would go into the center part of it and collect all of that. And so they put it up into artwork, and then over time we see that Aesthetically, they say that it kind of will interrupt the frieze, basically. That's what that band is. It comes from Frisia, because they made all these bands, so they called it a frieze. But, so we have that, but we put like flowers on it, right? That kind of thing. And I think that is still that representation of God's nature, God's beauty. And so the idea also with, like, if you're looking at the dentals, the teeth, they believe, though, that a lot of this happened because when they were first making these temples, they were all made out of wood. And these would be parts of the rafters, the deck that would hang over. And so after a while, they started to put that into marble, into stone. And so why these pilasters or columns are fluted is to kind of look like the bark on a tree. And that's how they originally had made these temples. But again, for our purposes, we just kind of see more of a classical style of a Greco-Roman kind of heritage. And that kind of points back to the committee that was overseeing the renovation of the sanctuary to say that they were still holding on to tradition, but also kind of looking toward the future.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think that's important, because you could ask that question too. Would a progressive church have classical architecture, right? That kind of thing. And so my family was just over in Durham, and they were at the chapel, and yes, a very progressive body of people would have a very classical style representing Durham over in England, that one. So you kind of have those aspects. I think that we can understand some kind of boundaries to it. John Ruskin was an art critic, architecture critic also, and he had these, it was called the 7 lamps of art. But I think 2 that are important for us. One was in architecture, you have to have sacrifice. Sacrifice showing that you've put forth the effort dedicated to God. God has gifted you with doing this. And then there are just some other aspects that you have to have truth, true to your materials. The building has to be beautiful. But the last one, the 7th one, he said obedience. In your art, in your architecture, you must be obedient to the values of God. And I think that is where you have some boundaries of where you'll take some of these aspects. So we have one of St. Martin's in the Field. This would be an Anglican church where they were very intentional about their design. You kind of see on the left, kind of looks familiar, right? That became a very popular style. Initially, when they were churches or cathedrals prior to that did not look like that, right? They did not take the temple and put it on the front and the back. It was some other aspects. But the interior is also very important. He was intentional because now when they meet to worship, this was Protestants, they were anti-papist and all of that. They were not focused on the mass, they were focused on the word. So now the center of attention will be the preaching, right? That is the intention behind it. It's kind of hard to see on the detail. He's taken off any kind of gargoyles or any kind of thing and made it basically like a public square. This is an Anglican church, so this is like Charles III, I guess now, but this would be, the King's Church. And so his like crest is on the front where the pediment is. But instead of putting all these artistic things, he put a clock, right? And just all of these things for common use for the people. So when you have this kind of design and architecture, it's very intentional. And so I have another one up there from Edward Sjovic. He called himself a theologian of space. I think this is St. Leo Catholic Church is the image, yeah. And so you kind of see the difference, right? From 1726 now to like the 1950s, there was a big church boom that happened in the 40s and 50s, and a lot of it were the A-frame churches or the chapels that we're so familiar with. But he chose this because he said, our faith is living. Right? It is a living faith that doesn't have to follow the patterns of the past. And so he was able, and we can kind of, I don't know, this might be a dispute of taste, right? Is this beautiful or not, right? This is very much modernism, a lot of straight lines, and that's pretty much it. And that's kind of the popular thing. That was the chapter that I wrote in the book. A lot of architects have chosen this because they believe that that's our evolutionary heritage. We like a lot of straight lines. We like a lot of glass. However, it shows just kind of neurologically we don't, right? We like curves and all these kinds of things. And I think that points to the Garden in Eden, all of just nature, just being ornate and, like you said, a little overwhelming sometimes.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely. And I'll say, I'm going to move on to this last one for time, but I want to say even today we see this whole plundering of the Egyptians is moving on, using even what we see in our culture to be turned around, to be redeemed and beautiful, to where there's probably, you've heard it said before, I don't want to go to a modern church service because it feels like I'm at a Coldplay concert or something like that is what you want to say. It just feels weird. But in the same way, what's happening now is that it's the plundering of the Egyptians that is happening now in the same way that this very building is evidence of the plundering of the Egyptians. You understand what I'm saying? And so it's how do we take what is in culture or present in that time or things in which people find beautiful and then we redeem that to be used by God. And I think that's an important thing for us to think about in everything that we do is what we are doing, displaying the beauty and the glory of God, and could we even take something that this world finds beautiful and redeem it to help them see the most beautiful thing, which is Christ. And so, look at that. Let's end here, maybe really quickly. What would you say then at church? What is the most important art form? Multiple different art is not just painting; it's music. It's many things. What would you say is the most important thing for the church to practice?
Yeah, I think it's music. I think we see that overwhelmingly so because, we could look at Bezalel and his architectural design that would completely omit all of the psalms, right? And all of the beauty and the song and the corporate worship, many different songs and laments in different cases. Beginning of Luke, you have all these different songs that many liturgical churches sing at Christmas and all of that. So I think that is where we can come together. Maybe not all of us sing well, right? But we can do it communally, and it connects us together because all of the imagery and the symbolism and the words, all of that connects us together. And so, yes, this is beautiful, but where we get together in a corporate worship and sing,
yes,
I think that is the most important. Maybe next food, but yes.
Yes, I agree. I would probably put that number one, but like a good steak, man. So, and I would say, why is music so important even for the church? Because what is the body of Christ going to be doing for all eternity? Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that we're sitting there for the rest of eternity and we're in a big choir the whole time. But what I'm saying is that song is going to be just a part of who we are because it's going to be inside of us. Yeah. What's going to naturally just pour out is this desire to praise and adore our Savior who's going to be there with us again. Yeah. And so what beautiful display to the world can we get? What greater display of God's beauty can we give to the world than just good music? Yeah. Music that draws your eyes upward, right? That causes you to worship and make something great happen. So, Eric, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I was going to make a joke beforehand and say, explain this to us like we're 5, because I know you're a lot smarter than probably every person in this room, but we appreciate you using the gifts that you have to serve the community and then also serve the church. Yeah. So we appreciate that.
Thank you, Doctor.
Hey, thank you for joining us for this episode of You Asked For It. Join us back in a couple of weeks where we'll get back on to the very study of the Apostles' Creed. Thank you.